It's the custom of the committee to swear in witnesses. Would the witnesses please stand and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Thank you. The first witness I'll recognize for 5 minutes is Ms. Liu.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Franks, members of the subcommittee, it's a pleasure to appear before you this morning to represent the Department of Justice and the dedicated professionals of the Housing and Civil Enforcement section of the Civil Rights Division, who work so hard to ensure non-discriminatory access to housing, credit, and public accommodations. I'm pleased to report on some of the outstanding accomplishments of that section. This April, we commemorated the 40th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, landmark legislation that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, or religion in the sale, rental, or financing of housing. Since the original act was passed in 1968, Congress has reaffirmed and expanded this country's commitment to fair housing by extending the act's protections to include sex, disability, familial status, and providing for much-needed enforcement tools. Although we've made progress over the last 40 years, there can be no question that housing discrimination exists today. Since 2001, the Division has filed 248 cases to enforce the civil provisions of the Fair Housing Act and obtain significant relief. In 2006, the Attorney General launched Operation Home Sweet Home, an initiative to combat housing discrimination focused on improving and expanding our fair housing testing program. Last fiscal year, we conducted more than 500 paired tests all across the country, 20% more than in any previous year. These tests are already producing new cases and significant results. For example, this January, we filed suit alleging that the owner and operator of an apartment complex in Roseville, Michigan, engaged in a pattern or practice of denying apartments to African Americans by falsely telling them that no apartments were available. In addition to that case, we have filed and settled 3 other cases based upon testing evidence just since last September. We also have achieved significant results in cases stemming from complaints filed with HUD. Just last month, we settled a particularly egregious case in which we alleged that the landlord of a housing complex in Virginia Beach, Virginia, imposed more restrictive rules on African American tenants, verbally harassed African American tenants with slurs and epithets, and evicted tenants by enforcing a limit of 2 children per family. The settlement we obtained requires the landlord to pay up to $319,000 to victims of discrimination and a $42,000 civil penalty. The Division's enforcement of the Fair Housing Act's protections against discrimination based on disability is also a vital element of our work. Since fiscal year 2005, we have obtained settlements requiring more than 14,500 apartments throughout the country to be made accessible to persons with disabilities under the Fair Housing Act. Cases alleging systemic sexual harassment by landlords also have been a priority. During this administration, we have filed 3 times as many systemic sexual harassment cases under the Fair Housing Act as the same time period in the prior administration. And we've achieved substantial relief for the victims of this kind of discrimination. Just in the past year, our sexual harassment settlements have provided for over $1 million in monetary damages and civil penalties. In this brief statement, I've had time to highlight just a few of the Division's many fair housing cases and investigations. But these examples demonstrate the Division's ongoing and steadfast commitment to doing its part to eradicate housing discrimination and bringing relief to victims of discrimination. We look forward to working closely and cooperatively with this committee in its efforts to protect the fair housing rights of all Americans. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The lady's time has expired. I thank the witnesses, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes to begin the questioning. Ms. Liu, 2 years ago, the Department of Justice launched Operation Home Sweet Home that you've referred to combat more hidden forms of discrimination. In the last fiscal year, the department conducted 20% more housing discrimination investigations. How many pattern and practice cases were filed as a result of these investigations?
Thank you so much for that question, Mr. Chairman. In February of 2006, the Attorney General announced Operation Home Sweet Home and to beef up our fair housing testing program. And in fiscal year 2007, as you mentioned, we had an extremely successful year with over 500 paired tests. That was 20% more than had been conducted in any prior year. I can tell you that since September of 2007, we have filed 4 cases based on testing evidence.
You filed 4 cases in the last, what, 6 months, 7 months? Well,
Since September.
9 months. 4 in the country? That sounds a little... How many were filed? How many pattern and practice investigations were filed in 2006?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure of the number off the top of my head.
Roughly.
I am not certain.
About how many have you been filing of pattern and practice investigations in recent years on an annual basis?
Under the testing, based on testing evidence?
Based on testing, based on not testing?
Over the last few years, the number of pattern and practice cases has averaged about 21 per year, I believe, but I can get you the more specific numbers.
Well, 21 sounds pretty specific. Roughly 25 pattern and practice cases a year. 3.5 million, I think you said 3.7 million housing discrimination cases, and we're filing 21 or 25 pattern and practice cases a year. That's 1 out of every 200,000 or something like that. Does that sound a little weak in terms of real enforcement?
Mr. Chairman, as I think I've said in my written statement, the Civil Rights Division's jurisdiction extends to pattern or practice cases, as well as cases in which HUD investigates, issues a charge, and one of the parties elects to proceed in federal court. The number 3.5 or 3.7 million, as I understand it, includes an estimated number of complaints of discrimination. So I just want to emphasize that our jurisdiction is to pursue the large-scale pattern or practice cases, as well as charges that HUD has issued and in which one of the parties has elected to proceed in federal court. So we deal with a much smaller subset than the 3.7 million number that has been referenced.
And how many land use and zoning cases has the department brought based on race or national origin in the last couple of years?
In this administration, Mr. Chairman, we've brought a number of land use and zoning cases based on race and national origin. We've also been very successful.
Wait a minute. I know you've brought a number. Can you be a little more specific than that?
Well, over the past 7 years, I know of at least 4 cases against municipalities in zoning and ordinance cases based on race and national discrimination.
4 cases in 7 years.
At least, and I'm certainly happy to get you more details on the numbers.
Again, do you think that that's a fair representation of a vigorous policy against land use and zoning discrimination?
I do. I think we've been very successful in bringing those cases. And
wait a minute. I'm asking, do you think you may have been very successful in those 4 cases, but do you think 4 cases over 7 years is a vigorous attempt to enforce the laws, including the laws against government, against land use and zoning discrimination?
I do, because those are at least, as I said, at least 4 cases in the zoning context against municipalities for alleged race and national origin discrimination. We also do many, many other kinds of cases. We had a very recent successful case against General Properties that resulted in $725,000 in relief.
Okay.
Ms. Liu, I wanted to ask you, what proactive measures is the Department of Justice taking to protect the rights of all Americans to obtain housing without illegal discrimination?
Congressman Franks, thank you for that question. Operation Home Sweet Home lies at the very center of our efforts to act proactively in seeking out discrimination. This is a fantastic initiative that the Attorney General announced in February of 2006. And what we do is we send out testers, both testers from a protected class and testers who are not from a protected class, all over the country to determine whether people are being treated differently on the basis of race, national origin, familial status, sex, etc. And we've been very successful. In fiscal year 2007, we conducted more than 500 paired tests all over the country. That was a record number for us. In fact,
how does that pair test work? Explain that for the less educated among us.
Sure. We'll identify, for example, an apartment complex that we would like to test, and we'll quite often make a phone call to find out whether or not they have vacancies. We will send in, for example, an African-American tester. They will express that they're looking, for example, for a one-bedroom apartment. They'll give a little background about themselves and their why they want the apartment and so on, and we will we'll track how they're treated. For example, whether they're told that an apartment is available, whether the property manager is polite to them, offers to show them apartments, and so forth. Very shortly afterwards, we may send in a white tester who has the same profile, who's looking for the same kind of apartment, and then we'll track how that person is treated. And based on this evidence, we're able to uncover hidden forms of discrimination. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we've filed a number of cases since last September, including a race discrimination case in Michigan, as well as the first ever case alleging discrimination against Asian Americans based on testing evidence, and that was in Lowell, Massachusetts. We settled that a little bit earlier this year. So we're very proud of that. In addition, we do a substantial amount of outreach. One example is we do outreach to the construction community. We do multi-family housing access forums twice a year all over the country, where we reach out to developers and architects and emphasize how important it is to everyone in the community that housing be built so that it's accessible to persons with disabilities. And we try to essentially stop the problems before they occur by educating people.
Well, Ms. Liu, this is more of a subjective question, but do you, in your capacity, sense any sense on the part of the administration to de-emphasize the effort to prevent housing discrimination in this country? Do you sense that there's any environment in the administration that has reduced your focus in that regard as opposed to previous administrations?
Absolutely not. This administration, this Department of Justice is completely and totally committed to fair housing, and I think we have a very good record on that. I should also add that we have the good fortune of working with some very talented and extremely dedicated career professionals in the housing and civil enforcement section, and I couldn't be prouder to work with them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is up. With where'd the yellow light go?
I don't know.
Okay.
All right. You know, Ms. Liu, you are the most positive person I've heard all day about this horrendous problem. And your courtesy and style is very charming. I'm just caught up with how wonderful this is and the progress we're making. Now, tell me, where did you ever practice civil rights law?
Sir, I began my career at Jenner & Block in both Chicago and here in D.C.,
Right.
a very fine firm, and I had the opportunity to do some housing enforcement work there. You may recall that there was a very large case against the city of Baltimore's housing authority a few years ago involving racial segregation, and I was lucky enough to be a part of that case.
Okay, now, Who were you representing in that case?
We were on the plaintiff's side, sir.
The plaintiff. And who was the plaintiff?
We worked with, and I wish I could, unfortunately, the name of the named plaintiff is escaping my memory right now, but Jenner and Block worked with one of the fair housing groups in Baltimore to bring suit, and I believe it was not only against the Housing Authority, but HUD as well. Yes.
All right. We'll find out afterward. Now, how long have you been in your position?
In my current position,
Yes.
since December of 2007.
So that's less than a year.
That's correct.
Okay. What we have here is a tremendous problem. Do you know how long it will take us to ever get this problem of 3.7 million fair housing violations dealt with at the rate that we're going?
Sir, I wish I could tell you how long it would take to eradicate housing discrimination in this country. I
didn't ask you all that. The fact of the matter is that we will never get it accomplished. So I don't need you to admit that you can't project it. I can't either. The point I'm trying to make is that at the rate we're going, I can't see how you could possibly positively come here to trumpet the accomplishments of either of these departments when the situation is horrendous and getting worse. Now, let me turn to Attorney Kendrick.
But the Attorney General of the United States describes the proliferation of problems around subprime as white-collar street crime. Would you agree with the Attorney General, Ms. Liu?
Congressman Davis, let me answer the question in two parts, if I could.
As long as one of them actually answers the question.
I'll do my best. The first part of the question is that the Civil Rights Division's jurisdiction in the fair lending area stems from the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And one of the things that we've done in the subprime area is that we have pursued a number of very large redlining cases in this administration, notably in the Chicago area, in Detroit.
But no, you're not suggesting the Justice Department's jurisdiction is limited to redlining subprime cases. There's no dispute that if there's an obvious instance of someone extending subprime to African Americans in a disproportionate manner, that you have jurisdiction. Let's not waste time arguing about that, given my 5 minutes. You're not suggesting that any of those things, if proved, would not be in the jurisdiction of the department, are you?
Those may well fall within the jurisdiction of the department, but not necessarily within the Civil Rights Division, which is the division that I work for. I will say that there are, as far as I know, a number of other components of the department that may have jurisdiction over those areas. The criminal division, for example, I would imagine may have jurisdiction to prosecute instances of out-and-out fraud.
Now, let me stop you at that point. Has the chief of the criminal division talked with you about the feasibility of a combined task force, perhaps, to address these problems? Why not take your expertise as someone who runs the housing section of civil rights? Why not match it up with the criminal division, which investigates fraud? Has that kind of internal conversation happened within the department?
Congressman Davis, we at the department have had a tradition of not discussing our internal deliberations for a variety of reasons, most notably so that we can have candid discussions and receive advice from the folks we work with without chilling them.
Have there been conversations with the chief of the criminal division about a combined, coordinated task force effort within the department to address not just the racial part of this problem, but the broader issues?
Sir, I believe the Attorney General made a statement about a mortgage fraud task force, and I really don't think it's appropriate for me to go beyond what the Attorney General has said on the matter.
If I could ask for additional 15 seconds just to follow up on that. Would you have an opinion on that, Ms. Liu? I mean, the Attorney General has made a statement that he's not going to appoint a task force, as a matter of fact. Does that strike you as being an advisable decision? There was a task force regarding Enron. Frankly, Enron did not cause the kind of ripple effects in this economy that the securities crisis and the subprime crisis has caused. This is worse than Enron, isn't it? From what you read in the paper, isn't this worse than Enron?
I appreciate your question, but I really don't think it's appropriate for me to go beyond what the Attorney General has said.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Ms. Liu, do whites and African Americans and Hispanics have subprime loans at the same rate?
Sir, I don't know the statistics, so I am unwilling to express a view on those statistics. I have seen news reports that indicate that there may be some disparity.
Yeah, so are you saying you don't want to express a view on whether or not there's a disproportionate impact of the subprime mortgage crisis on people of color than others?
I've seen news reports that
Indeed.
seem to suggest that there is a disparity.
Well, you'd agree that the subprime mortgage crisis is a housing issue, right?
I would agree that broadly speaking, the subprime crisis is a mortgage issue.
Is it an issue that your department has focused on at the disproportionate numbers that you've heard about in the press of subprime mortgages?
If I could, I'd like to highlight some of the work that we've done.
I can read about that. Can you tell me, have you had any, I mean, I'm still stuck on this idea that you don't know whether or not there's a disproportionate impact. Why don't you know that?
Sir, I can tell you about what I've seen in the news reports. I can tell you what reports that I've read.
Has your department done any focused research on this issue?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm happy to go back and get back to you with the response.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and I recognize for 5 minutes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Liu, you've referred to the 500 testing pairs several times. That's about one per congressional district, 435 congressional districts. So it's about one per district. What results did you find from those tests?
Sir, I've already mentioned that we have brought some cases based on the results of those tests. Since the beginning of the testing program, I believe we've brought about 85 cases, 53 or so of those.
85 cases were brought out of the 500 tests?
No, 85 since the beginning of our testing program, which was begun in the early 90s.
Out of the 500 tests, what kind of differences did you detect from the protected classes, and how were they treated differently?
Well, we have one case that we're currently pursuing in the Detroit area in Roseville, Michigan, in which we found that the owners and operators of the apartment complex were telling African American testers that there were no apartments available, while telling white testers that there were apartments available.
Out of 500 pairs, how often was discrimination detected?
I can tell you that since September, we've brought 4 cases, and I also want to add.
Wait, that's 1% experience of discrimination. 99% of the time, there was no discrimination detected by the testers?
Congressman Scott, whenever we find that the law and the facts justify bringing a case alleging discrimination, we do that.
I've heard of studies that show that almost routinely, when you send out pairs, that there is a difference in treatment. And you're saying that in about 99% of the cases, there is no difference in treatment. Is that your testimony?
No, sir. My testimony is that whenever we find that the evidence and the law justifies bringing a case, and remember we have pattern or practice authority and not general authority to bring cases alleging individual
Well,
instances of
I'm not asking
discrimination.
authority to bring a case or whether you can even make a case. What kinds of differences did you detect between the pair going into the same apartment? I mean, I assume this is not only apartments, but home ownerships. You go into realtors
We
and
do
find
do
out
sales testing, yes.
Okay, and what kinds of differences, did you find a difference only in about 1% of the cases, or was it routine like everybody else in the world has seen?
I think I've described earlier some of the kinds of differences that we've seen, and I can just state again that when we find that there's evidence to justify, remember, we're looking for pattern or
Well, I'm
practice.
not asking, I just ask you a simple question. What kinds of differences did you detect from the way people were treated based on your pairs?
We have seen members of protected classes being told that there are no apartments available.
And how often does that occur?
We have, we've brought 4 cases based on.
How often does it occur that people are given different stories about the availability of apartments? How often? 1%? 20%? 50%?
I can't, as I sit here right now, put a number on that. I can tell you what we look for is whether or not we can bring a lawsuit, and where we think that we can, based
Well,
on
you
the
know,
law and the facts, we do.
I'm asking you a simple question, not whether you can bring a lawsuit, but what kinds of differences people occur. And I'm not getting an answer. I got one answer that 1% of the time there's a difference, and I think people would be shocked to hear that number, quite frankly, and you're under oath. That 1% of the time people go finding an apartment, they're not given a different story. Now, the question is, what kinds of differences were people, how often were people given different stories?
Sir, I don't know the answer to that question, because what we're looking for is whether or not we can file a case, whether the facts in the law warrant filing a case under our pattern or practice authority.
Well, let me ask Mrs. Kendrick if...
Ms. Liu, don't you think there needs to be a more coordinated, multidisciplinary, outside the silos that you all operate approach to dealing with this? This is the Justice Department, and basically you've just said this is localized crime, and we're going to let local people deal with this. That's ridiculous, isn't it, Ms. Liu?
Congressman Watt, I appreciate your remarks, but I'm not.
You appreciate them and you agree with them too, don't you?
I didn't say that I appreciate.
I mean, but everything you've said suggests that there needs to be some coordination of this effort, which is exactly what we have asked the Attorney General to do.
Sir, I'm not in a position to go beyond what the Attorney General has said, or I'm certainly not in a position to second-guess his excellent judgment.
Well, in this case, you may find him to have excellent judgment in some cases. In this case, everything that you have said suggests that his judgment is not so excellent, Ms. Liu. I yield back.